Welcome everybody and welcome to another session of ICIE Talks. My name is Nana Gulic and today I will be introducing today's lecture. The topic of today is building on resilience, models and frameworks, and our special guest is Professor Dr. Fred Bonner from Prairie View A&M University from Prairie View, Texas, USA. Fred Bonner II is professor and endowed chair in educational leadership and counseling and executive director and chief scientist of Mach 3 Center at Prairie View A&M University. He is formerly the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair in Education in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University and an esteemed expert in the field of diversity in education. Prior to joining Rutgers, he was professor of higher education administration and dean of faculties at Texas A&M University College Station. He earned a BA in chemistry from the University of North Texas, an MS Ed in curriculum and instruction from Baylor University, and an Ed.D. in higher education administration and college teaching from the University of Arkansas. Bonner has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the American Association for Higher Education Black Caucus Dissertation Award and the Educational Leadership Counseling and Foundations Dissertation of the Year Award from the University of Arkansas College of Education. With us today is also Professor Taysir Yamin, an Executive Director at International Center in Innovation and Education, and he will introduce the lecture for us all.
Thank you, Nana, for this introduction. And first of all, I would like to welcome my friend and brother, Fred Bonner, from Mach 3, and also my sister, Stella Smith. She is the Associate Director of Mach 3 at Prairie View University. Today's talk will address a number of topics. Building on resilience, models and the frameworks. While many studies of African American students in the United States focus on deficits and failure, this keynote will introduce the outcomes of research literature by focusing on assets and success. A number of key strategies will be offered for administrators, teachers, graduate students, and researchers who seek viable ways to promote the success of gifted African American males. This keynote is based on Bonner's book entitled Building on Resilience, Models and the Frameworks of U.S. Black Male Success Across the B-20 Pipeline. In addition to the U.S. context, this lecture will engage critical dialogue on the impact of disadvantage, racism, and underrepresentation in comparative and international contexts. His work has been featured nationally and internationally. He is the author of several books, including this book. Welcome, Fred Bonner, in this keynote speech.
Greetings. I am Fred A. Bonner II, Professor and Endowed Chair in the Department of Educational Leadership and Counseling at Prairie View A&M University in Prairie View, Texas. And I also serve as the Executive Director of the Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability Center, affectionately known as Mach 3. So today, I come to you from the warm and hot state of Texas to share with you building on resilience, models and frameworks. And this particular presentation, come along with me and engage with me in an hour as I unpack and as we talk about how to build on resilience, particularly for African American and Black male populations in the US. So come along on this journey and let's move forward. So I would like to start off by thanking my dear friend and brother, Professor Tassir Yamin, who serves as the the director of the International Conference on Innovation in Education, ICIE, as we affectionately call it. So when Tassir mentioned the ICIE Talks as his new initiative, I just was chomping at the bit to get an opportunity to engage with you, to engage with the international audiences, and also to share this research that is so very important, that sits at the intersection of giftedness, creativity, high ability, particularly for underserved populations, particularly our Black male populations in the US. So hopefully by the time we finish this presentation, I will be able to contextualize for you who these Black males are, who these gifted Black males are, and what their experiences are, and the experiences that lead to them being successful in educational contexts. In the United States, we talk a lot about K-12 education or P-12 education, and we also talk about education that moves into higher ed sphere and beyond into the workplace. So I like to capture that particular continuum by codifying it as the P20 pipeline. So we're going to talk about Black males as they progress in education across the P through 20 pipeline. P20 is from pre-kindergarten all the way through graduate, professional school, and into the workforce. So let's unpack what it means to build on resilience and to structure effective models and frameworks for Black male populations, gifted Black male populations. So as we look, and I always like to start off with one of the seminal architects for a focus on Black studies, for a focus on actually the field of sociology. Many refer to W.E.B. Du Bois as one of our first sociologists, and particularly one of our first Black sociologists. So W.E.B. Du Bois, as you look at his work, as you look at his career, and particularly as you look at some of the interesting things he said, some of the things that he coined, one of the terms that that's most striking to me is his reference to the color line. And you see here, I took the quote, in 1903, W.B. Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." He says the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. So I will submit to you the reason I'm starting with the quote from W.B. Du Bois. I don't think in this very contemporary context that what W.B. Du Bois said all the way back in 1903 is confined to the United States, to America. As we look across the globe right now, we see that the problem of the color line is international, it's global. So some of these very issues that he talked about in a very American context, flash forward to 2021, we're seeing some of these very same things happening in Europe, happening in Australia, happening in other countries. And many of these problems go right back to W.B. Du Bois and his statement about the color line. So I started there because I thought that his words were instructed not just for the United States in 1903, not just for the Americas in 2021, but for the globe. And as we look at and as we deal with issues of race, color, and the color line. So W.B. Du Bois, and I always share this picture just because I like it. To me, for me, this is quintessential W.B. Du Bois. His face, the countenance, to me is just so much just scripted by his countenance in this picture. But this is a picture of W.B. Du Bois, and I, as I said, I just really think there's a lot of power behind the eyes and the intense focus of this legendary figure who has meant so much to us by way of how we progressed as a people and how we have progressed as a nation, not just for Black people, but the nation in general. And again, The field of sociology owes a great debt to W.B. Du Bois and some of the very early work that he did. One of his seminal works, The Souls of Black Folk, also another one of his works, which is considered one of the first ethnographic studies in the country, the Philadelphia Negro. So he was a towering figure, and we still profit from the brilliance, the largesse of his intellect as we look at the life of W.B. Du Bois. And I thought, what better anchor, what better person, what better intellectual figure to use as the touchstone for this presentation that focuses on how to build resilience through models and frameworks for our Black male populations in general and for some of our populations of color in particular. Next slide. So I always start off, so I talked about W.B. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois as a legendary figure. Let's bring it forward from 1903 to a little bit more of a current context, 1950s, 60s. Another towering figure, another towering Black male who had a very, very strong presence in our history. And who you see on this slide is the Reverend Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor. And for those of you who have not heard this name before, or for those of you in the States, my international brothers and sisters, if you've not heard of this man, I would encourage you to Google him. Google's Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, and you will see that he was, again, a towering figure. He was the first African-American to gain full professor at Rutgers University. He served in the Kennedy administration. He was one of the first directors of the Peace Corps. And I think most interesting is that one of our main figures from history, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Proctor served as one of his mentors. So having that pedigree, having that background, and having shaped and touched the life of one of our key figures from history, from civil rights history, Dr. Martin Luther King, I just think Dr. Proctor's, not only because I served as the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair during my time at Rutgers University, in doing my homework, I wanted to know more about this man, and I wanted to be able to anchor everything that I did in his theories, in his philosophies, in his ways of thinking about education, particularly for education that benefited populations of color, because that's what he was known for in recruiting, retaining populations of color, particularly African-American populations. So in doing my homework and transitioning from my time at Texas A&M University to Rutgers University, when I took on the endowed chair, I said, let me really figure out who this man is, and let me truly figure out how I can honor his legacy. And one of the ways that I decided that I could do that was through, what could I read? What could I quote? What could I cite that would really provide a vision for who this man was? You know, what was the linchpin? What was the cynosure? What was the thing that pulled it all together, that encapsulated who he was? Well, my homework led me to several books, several articles, several sermons, and I landed on this one particular sermonette. And I say sermonette because it's not a full sermon, it's short. And this sermonette is titled The Scratch Line. And I used the scratch line, I used this particular sermonette to basically encapsulate, to describe, to frame everything that I did by way of my activities. Here's an example. I sponsored a black male STEM think tank, and I called it moving Black males in STEM beyond the scratch line. I actually hosted historically Black college and university, HBCU, deans in their various colleges of education. And I called that particular event, Moving Deans in the College of Education Beyond the Scratch Line in the HBCU context. So you get it, on and on and on. Everything that I did was grounded in the theoretical framework, the conceptual framework set by this very, very important man. So what I would like to do is to share with you briefly the sermonette. And before I do, there are two things that I want you to consider. And I typically throw this out there when I'm presenting, when I'm consulting with audiences. I want you to think about, particularly in terms of what we do related to diversity or internationalism, what are you doing to raise your student populations and your colleagues beyond the scratch line? And what are you doing to raise yourself beyond the scratch line? So I want you to think about those questions. The Reverend Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor and his sermonette, The Scratch Line. So again, my dear colleagues and my dear friends out there, I encourage you to think, what are you doing to raise populations beyond the scratch line? And also, what are you doing to raise yourself beyond the scratch line? So that particular sermonette, I hope it causes you to think. And I would encourage you to Google, find it out there in cyberspace, and use it as one of your touchstones to initiate conversation about what we are doing, particularly in creativity and gifted education, to move our populations and to move ourselves beyond the scratch line. So with that said, let's move us forward. So what I would like to do is to spend some time now engaging with you in discourse and a conversation, virtual discourse, and a conversation about what is one of the quintessential important issues that rack our brains, rack our minds, and really cause us to spend a lot of time and a great degree of angst in just trying to understand what we need to do and how we can facilitate success for our gifted population. And much of this goes back to, we can't build on resilience until we have these clear conversations about race. So for those of you that have watched us, see us on the news, and for those of you that look at the news around the world, again, we know many of our issues goes back to that very first slide, W.B. Du Bois, the color line. But what I would like to unpack for you now is the current state of affairs, particularly as relates to race in the United States. Because we can't get to issues in discussing giftedness, creativity, innovation, and education until we truly look at the core of what many of these issues rest on, and that's the issue of race. So I'm going to share with you, going back again, and this presentation is very, as you can see, very heavily laden with some of our Black, some of our African American early architects. So you saw W.B. Du Bois, you saw Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, and now you're going to see one of our legends. And I thought this clip was very, very instructive, just to kind of whet the appetite and to have you to come into a better understanding of how long the issue of race, the specter of race, has been an important part of the fabric of the United States, not just the country in general, but our educational institutions in particular. But let's take a listen to, again, one of our. So there you have it. James Baldwin, who gave us a very, very clear and concise picture of the world that he saw at that time in the 1940s, in the 1930s, 1950s. A world where race played such a quintessential part of what and how he had to operate and how he had to function as a Black man. And we see some of those very same negotiations that Black people in this country, males, females, how they have to negotiate and navigate their worlds just to be able to be successful, to participate in some of these very American institutions like education, P-12 education, higher education. So again, as we look at the focus of today's presentation, building on resilience models and frameworks, that is why I start off with this conversation that talks about race. So let's take a peek at the next slide. And what I'm sharing with you delves deeper into this conversation about race relations in the United States. And this information has been taken from the Gallup poll. The Gallup institution here in the United States, they collect a lot of varied information related to issues, not just about race, but about different aspects of the national diaspora. But this particular slide and these slides that I'm going to show you are all connected to and sets the groundwork for the discussion that we're having here today about how to build on resilience, but how to move out of the structure and the strictures that race places on particular populations, particularly our gifted Black males. So you see here, this particular slide gives a rendering of race relations between Blacks and whites in the United States. So we see here, would you say relations between white and Blacks are very good, somewhat bad, or very bad? And you see here, the dark green line represents Black adults. The lighter green line, trend line, represents white adults. So the one point that I want to make here is that if you had to construct a narrative to explain the numbers, so if you had to put a qualitative explanation to overlay on top of this quantitative data that you're observing here, what would your narrative be? What words would you use? One of the first things that I see, and one of the first words that comes to my mind, is disparities. We talk a lot about disparities, and we see gaps. So gaps between Black adults and white adults in their perceptions of race relations and how race relations are operationalized in this country as being good, somewhat bad, or very bad. So again, as you look at the trend lines here, you see that there has been a overall trend that has been going downward from 2002 to our current context of 2020, 21. But again, although the trend lines are going down, but we still see that there are major gaps in between these populations across this continuum. And I think those is very important to look at these data, because they really tell a story about how our two populations in this country, how they are experiencing and how they view the world through their respective lenses. So let's take a look at the next slide. So again, this slide comes from our U.S. Department of Education. And this one provides an overview of advanced course credit earned in secondary school by subject and by race. So as you're looking at this particular slide, you see that the dark blue represents white populations, and the orange represents Black populations. And again, I would encourage you, as I encourage my doctoral students, what does the quantitative data, what does it say qualitatively? So if you had to explain the numbers, what would you say? So as I'm looking across the various subjects, all subjects, math, science, and as I'm looking at the two different populations, again, the words that pop in my head are disparities, gaps, differences. So achievement, lack of achievement, lack of representation. So again, these data reflect the percent of students earning any credit in advanced placement courses and international baccalaureate. So as we look at the courses and the course curriculum in the United States, particularly at the P12 level, international baccalaureate and advanced placement are like our two top tiers related to courses and coursework. So we see here, as we're looking at that upper echelon of courses that are made available to our P12 students, we see these wide disparities between Black populations and white populations. Okay, next slide. Here is another slide that comes from the magazine Business Insider. And the source is from an article, Opportunity Insights, Intergenerational Educational Mobility by Race. And we see here, they're looking at children whose parents only graduated high school who earned a college degree. So we see here, we look at the mobility of Asian populations, the highest. The next highest population, white populations, Hispanic, Blacks, and our indigenous populations, our Native American populations. So we see here, as we're looking at the children whose parents only graduated with a high school diploma, who earned a college degree, and we're looking at their opportunities to be mobile and to move into the workforce and to move into careers that would provide not only them as adults, but opportunities for their children, for them to support their children. So we see here that the gaps, the differences are quite stark. Next slide. Another slide reflecting, we're looking here, this is from the US Census Bureau. Again, what quantitative data here, what are the quantitative data here telling us about, telling us qualitatively? Again, white populations in blue, Black populations in orange. The story that I see here, although we see college attainment increasing for both populations, there's an upward trend. However, the upward trend still reflects a great gap, disparities, achievement gaps, opportunity gaps, resource gaps. There are so many gaps that cause these disparities between these two populations. So again, although the trend is upward, you see white populations at 35.2%, Black populations at 25.2%. That is a 10 percentage gap between white populations and Black populations in their college attainment. Next slide. So I put this particular slide up because it really gets to the core of my research and what I focus on. My research is primarily focused on academically gifted African-American males, particularly those African-American males in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this story I found very, very interesting. This is a young man, Darius Brown, and he graduated from Lancaster High School in Dallas, Texas. The Texas pronunciation, we call it Lancaster, but Lancaster High School in Dallas, Texas. And this particular story was quite moving because it gave a real world snapshot of what this young Black man had to go through in the school district just to not only get the services that he needed, but to get the recognition that he needed as a gifted African-American male. So it chronicles the story of his mother, how she had to go in, how she had to advocate and fight for her son just to be placed in gifted and talented courses. So this story is recapitulated so many times when we look at our Black populations, particularly our gifted Black populations in the United States, and how they're marginalized, how it takes so much to get them placed in gifted and talented courses and curriculum that will allow them to excel and be successful. But again, this particular story, Darius Brown, Darius was quite successful. You see here, he was the first from his campus to receive a Gates Millennium Scholarship. And it paid for his tuition. And he actually enrolled in one of our Texas institutions, actually an institution in our system here, Texas A&M University. But again, Darius' story is all too common when we look at African-American males who are highly, highly gifted, highly, highly high achieving. But they are many times, they go unrecognized and they go under-recognized for programming that would keep them moving in gifted and talented tracks. So next slide. So what about, typically when I consult with schools, school districts, higher ed institutions, I like to engage the audience. And one of the first things that I do is I want them to think. I want the audience to think about, particularly as we're trying to set the stage for what we need to understand about academically gifted African-American males. So this particular slide is the first activity that I have the audience to engage in. So in this activity, I put up this collage of photos that you see, and my question to the audience is, who is gifted? Who is gifted? So I'm going to take a little pause. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes or so. I know we're out there in cyberspace, and I know that we're recording this, but I'm just going to take a little pause to give you an opportunity to peruse these photos and respond to the question, who is gifted? Okay, so as we look at the photos, and I'll just share with you some of the comments that I have heard as I've traversed many different institutional contexts. So I will hear things like the young man at the top in the upper left, maybe or maybe not. Well, he has all the tattoos, and my vision for giftedness is, more of a clean cut look. So I'm not quite sure about the tattoos, that is that conservative look that I perceive to be associated with gifted behavior. So the young boy in the middle at the top, he's reading a book. So many would say, oh, well, he's showing very early promise of being gifted and talented. The young man at the far right at the top, it appears that they're in an academy or perhaps a boys' school or a young men's school. So many of them, many individuals will say, well, surely they're gifted. It seems like they're in a prep school or some academic academy. So yes, they're gifted. And if we go down to the bottom left corner, the young brother who is in the US, the term we use a lot for the pants that are below the waist as sagging. So many view sagging as something that's very culturally specific, culturally loaded, that's very much associated with particular populations and sometimes associated with populations of color, although not exclusively, but many times individuals will look at young Black and brown Hispanic males who are sagging. They associate non-gifted behavior with that particular phenotypic look. So to the right of him, the Black man there appears to be a doctor, a medical doctor. So for many individuals, that's low-hanging fruit. Sure, Absolutely, he's gifted. He's a medical doctor. He went through medical school. Clearly, he has gifts and talents, particularly in the area of STEM, if he finished a medical degree. Just to the right of him, you see a group of Black men that appear to be in a chain gang, that appear to be in some way incarcerated, jail, prison. So for many people, they associate being incarcerated, being behind bars, a statement is sometimes made, or in some way being with your freedom being restricted, whether through the prison system or any other system that restricts movement or serves as a way of punishing a crime or punishing some infraction as indication that these individuals couldn't be gifted. But I say, actually, we see and we know from the literature that some of our most brilliant people from the past to contemporary times have been people who have been incarcerated for short periods of time, long periods of time. So one of the things that we know is some of the most brilliant people on the planet are people who might have been or who might be incarcerated. So that kind of gives you a rendering of the various photos and the conversations that I sometimes have with school districts, with principals, with teachers, with community members about who is gifted. So what I want you to do is to spend some time thinking about looking at these photos and truly problematizing, thinking about what giftedness means and what your perceptions are of what giftedness looks like. All right, next slide. So here's a report, and you see this daunting picture. I thought this picture was a very good depiction and representation of the narrative that went along with it. So this picture comes from the Schott Foundation, S-C-H-O-T-T. So the Schott Foundation, they put out a report every 3 years or so that gives a rendering of how Black males and how Hispanic males, or sometimes we say Latinx males, are doing by way of education in the United States. So the Schott report, they rely very heavily on the NAEP data. In the United States, that's the National Assessment of Education Progress, NAEP. And many times, another name for this is the America's Report Card. So basically, the NAEP data tells you how Black males are doing in reading, writing, literacy, and how they're doing in mathematics and in science. So the NAEP data, and again, this is just one data source, I would say probably the most heavily relied upon data source from the Schott Foundation. They use other statistics and other data and other data sets. But one particular report that emerged from the very last comprehensive report that the Schott Foundation put out was called Invisible Men. And this is a picture from the Invisible Men report. And you see here, and I just captured a statement from that report that shows you just how dire and just how convoluted and complex some of the ways that we look at Black and brown males in this country, particularly those in the education system. So you see here, in most states here in the United States, it is easier for the public to track the number of Black and Latino males who are incarcerated, those who are in jail, than the number of graduates from a high school at any given year. So I thought this was quite profound. We have a better tracking system of Black and Hispanic males who are incarcerated than we do for Black and Hispanic males who are graduating from high school. Therefore, this particular report, they unpack several what they call invisibilities that lead to this situation. So they state that there are invisible students. We don't know how to track where all of our students are. Here in the United States, many schools and school districts, they actually will stop tracking students at a particular time along their educational continuum. However, Once they get to the final grade here, typically what we call the 12th grade, many schools will report that these Black males were there, they were enrolled, whether they were there or not for all those years. So you have all these students who were invisible throughout their academic careers, but the institutions will count them just because they're there and at a time to graduate, time for graduation. So they're invisible students. They also talk about there being invisible diplomas. So not all diplomas, not all graduate certificates from the United States schools, school districts, high schools, not all of them are weighted the same. In this country, there are some diplomas that will recognize a student and will graduate a student, allow a student to graduate from school, having only done what we call work-related tasks, as opposed to academic tasks. So there are some degrees that are, some diplomas that are more about the work that the student did, the practical skills that the student did, but as opposed to the academic skills that they need to move into college, or some of the moving forward with their academic pursuits. So invisible diplomas. And it also talks about how there is invisible data. Many times we will aggregate African American and Hispanic males, put them all together, and basically report the data as an aggregate. But the problem with this is you have to deconstruct, you have to disentangle and disengage, because the experiences, although many of the experiences are the same, there are many of those experiences that are very, very different. Some based on race, some based on geographic location, some based on finances and resources that are made available. But we tend to report in the aggregate. And when you report in the aggregate, it takes away and it teases out all of the nuances that we truly need to understand if we're going to make a difference for these students individually. Okay, next slide. So I've talked about the SHOT report. And again, I would encourage all of you to Google SHOT, S-C-H-O-T-T, Foundation. And their latest report is the hook, the title is Black Lives Matter. And you will see this particular video that I'm about to show you that gives you an idea of what the SHOT Foundation, what follows in their report. But I think this video really sets the stage, not only for their report, but it sets the stage for what we're talking about today.
Hey there, you might have noticed America has a crisis, a broken economy for too many, an eroding democracy, and shrinking opportunities. So how can we deal with all of this? Well, our biggest untapped resource is right in front of us. Surprised? Consider this. When Black men graduate from high school with a solid foundation, we go on to solve big problems. We serve our country and earn college degrees in the millions. We build new businesses at a faster rate and contribute more of our income to charity than the average American household. But right now, America is only getting 1 out of 7 Black boys proficient in reading by 4th grade, and only 1 in 10 proficient in science by 8th grade. By high school, our country is enrolling only 1 out of 8 young Black men in advanced placement classes, and only getting 1 out of 3 off to college. America can do better. Just imagine the things we can accomplish if all of us have a real opportunity to learn. Our country's future gets a lot brighter. See what's possible.
So the SHOT video provides you with an overview of just how stark and how dire some of the situations are. Dire, but not dire in a way that they can't be corrected if we put some corrective action towards improving the conditions for this population. So what I'm showing you now is a state-by-state depiction of the graduation rates of Black male students in the United States. And this is actually a screen capture. And what I like about this particular diagram is that when you're actually on the shot report site, you can actually click on each and every one of the states, and it will give you a comprehensive rendering of how Black males are doing in that state when it relates to, as it relates to reading, writing, and literacy, and as I stated, mathematics and science. So we see here from the legend that's at the bottom of this page, you see that the red states are graduation rates below 50%. The pink states have graduation rates between 50 and 59%. The light green states, graduation rates between 60 and 69%. And the dark green state, graduation rates between 70% and above. So one of the things that I want to share with you is that as we're looking across the United States for here in this country, we see that there are very, very few dark green states. And those are states with the highest graduation rates of 70% and beyond. And it's interesting to note that many of these states, particularly in the West, Montana, North Dakota, Idaho, and Arizona, very, very low percentages of African-American males. So although these states have 70% graduation rates, the numbers are very, very small because you don't have high populations of African-Americans or Blacks in those states. As we look over at the East Coast, some of the a major outlier there is New Jersey. New Jersey happens to be one of our states here in this country with a pretty high percentage of Black males. And as I stated, I was the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair at Rutgers University, which happens to be located in New Jersey. So when I spent time there and would share this slide, individuals there in the audience would say to me, oh, well, Dr. Bonner, we can tell you exactly why that's the case. Because here in the state of New Jersey, we went through this initiative years ago called the Abbott Initiative. And what this initiative did was to ensure that there was equity between low-income schools and higher-income schools. So that equity and ensuring equity, it increased and enhanced the success of Black male populations. But the one thing that I want you to hear, I didn't say equality, I said equity. So as we look at gifted populations, as we look at inclusion, diversity, equity, social justice, it's not about equality, it's about equity. And what do I mean as I unpack those two terms? So let me just briefly give you an example I typically use. One of the seminal authors, theorists in education is Howard Gardner, but also Jonathan Kozol, Savage Inequalities. And in Savage Inequalities, Kozol gives a very, very good explanation of the importance of understanding the difference between equity and equality. And Kozol uses these two school districts, a high-income school district and a low-income school district, and Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and East St. Louis. So one school district, predominantly white, the other school district, predominantly Black. But what Kozol showed through his example is that, and this book is from the 80s, from the 1980s. So the experiment was each school district was going to get $1 million. So equally distributed, equality, equal distribution of $1 million, low income district, high income district. But what this particular experiment revealed is that the high income district, they used their $1 million for things like more computers, swimming pool, horses for the equestrian club. So all of these accoutrements that you would see and that you would expect in a school district with very, very high income, with taxes and resources that would provide for the students. When you look at East St. Louis, they spent their money on things like infrastructure and like supplies and repairing the cafeteria, repairing restrooms. So as we see, although we gave $1 million equally, because you were starting off with inequitable situations from the beginning, so your ground zero was inequitable, so therefore equality was not equality. So it's really, really important to look at the differences between equity and equality. As we move beyond equity and equality, there are some other key terms that are very, very important as we look at building on resilience and what it means, particularly as we look at the intersections of race. Here are a couple of terms that we throw around a lot right now: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I add another dimension, belonging. So as we're looking at improving the conditions for these high achieving Black males, as we look at ways to build resilience, and as we look at, again, going back to the very beginning of this talk, the specter and the importance and the sometimes albatross that race has on these populations, we have to look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and at the center of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you see from this diagram, is belonging. So truly unpacking and understanding that it's not just about having a diverse representation. It's not just about ensuring that everyone has a say in what goes on, but it's also looking at ensuring that everyone feels that they belong in the space. So at the center of our efforts to ensure there's diversity, equity, inclusion is belonging. Next slide. So I just put this up there, and again, you're out there in cyberspace and you're watching me probably days, maybe a week after I actually filmed this. But what I would encourage you to do is take a peek at this conceptually clustered matrix. And I enjoy using conceptually clustered matrices because I think they really give you an opportunity to see the landscape as you think through activities and as you think through effective ways to meet your particular targets, whatever those targets are. This actual concept for me comes from teaching my dissertation seminar course. So just about every semester, I have a dissertation course where, and as I've instructed students and I served as a chair and taken 25, 30 plus students through the dissertation process, one of the things that I saw that students consistently struggle with is how to connect their theoretical frameworks to the actual findings. Well, this concept actually applies as we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which are theoretical and conceptual frameworks. And many times we want to operationalize those through different people, and we want to come up with different activities. Much the same that my doctoral students do and they struggle with their dissertations. I think we struggle with the very same thing. So let's engage in the very same activity that I have my students to engage in, but now let's do it through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So here's just one activity when I'm out working with school districts and working with institutions that really want to know, how do we put diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into action? You know, I hear it, the theory, but how can I make it real? Well, here's one of the ways. So I gave you different groups, different populations, administrators. You know, here in the United States, is it a principal? Is it a superintendent? Is it a curriculum coordinator? Is it a gifted coordinator? What we see here, gifted coordinators, we see teachers, we see students, we see parents, and we see community members. How do you engage your community? Because everyone needs to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So as we look at, let's look across the horizontal. You see the anchors, the constructs, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And you see on the vertical, the various groups, the various cohorts who are going to implement these constructs. Administrators. So administrators and diversity. In that particular cell, what should administrators be doing by way of diversity? Move to the right, equity. What should administrators be doing by way of equity? Moving, inclusion. What should administrators be doing related to inclusion? And finally, belonging. You repeat that same exercise with each one of your constituent groups: gifted coordinators, teachers, students, parents, and community. Again, this is just giving you a real world way to attack and to physically think about, mentally think about ways to engage all of these constructs in constructive ways and to have some real program that's associated with each. Next slide. So this just reifies the statement that I made about equity and inclusion. And again, my research focuses on gifted African-American males, gifted Black males. So we see here, and this particular figure, this picture, it gives you a visual representation of the differences between equality and equity. So we see here the children on the left, they all have boxes. However, you have one child, the young man appears, he's so tall that giving him a box, he really doesn't need it. He could see over the fence without the box. And giving the young woman in the middle a box, she's quite short, so that box that you gave her in by way of equality, the same box that you gave to the young man, is not tall enough for her. So equality doesn't work here. And look at the child to the far right, who's actually in a wheelchair, who doesn't need a box at all. So when we move our mindset beyond focusing on equality and truly focusing on equity, we see here that in an equitable situation, the young man doesn't need a box at all. The young woman, she needed 2 boxes. And the child in the wheelchair actually needed a ramp. So this is one of the best representations of the difference between equity and equality. And 2, I gave you a narrative here that comes from the literature. So we see nationwide, approximately 13% of elementary students from high-income families, those not needing a box, are enrolled in gifted programs compared to just 2% from low-income families. And this is a study conducted by Vanderbilt University. So this is a narrative that shows you that for some of those high-income families, they don't necessarily need a box. Some of those low-income families, maybe they need 2 boxes. Okay, next slide. So here's just another way of saying the very same thing that I said. The metaphor, what we use in the analogy in the previous slide for boxes. Now let's take it out to the field, track and field. So let's look at the track and the field. So we see here, equality means that everyone starts at the same scratch line, as Dr. Proctor would say. So everyone starts at the same point. Well, you have individuals with different heights, different abilities, different gaits. So equity basically says that, well, everyone's coming with a very different set of physical circumstances. So it's not fair to start everyone at the same line. So let's stagger them. So equity is about staggering to ensure that everyone, now that staggered line creates a sense of equity, as opposed to the equality that you see where everyone starts at the same point. That doesn't quite work. Next slide. So I want to briefly share with you all that I've been building up to. All of this is connected to and centers on my research and my research agenda. So I'm just going to very, very briefly share with you, these are some of the main topics across my research and my agenda. Many of the discussions have led to discussions about deficit modeling, how we define giftedness, how we look at identity development. How do students learn, grow, and develop? So, and also generational challenges. We know that there are millennial generation, greatest generation. We know that there's the boomer generation. So I say all that to say across these different generations and through these different generational lenses, individuals are going to see achievement and think about achievement very, very differently. So we see here, I call this slide, we talk about what I call the big three. There are three primary reasons that Black males, African-American males go unidentified and under-identified for gifted and talented programming. And these three reasons are lack of teacher referral, poor test performance, and choice. Very, very briefly, we talked about lack of teacher referral because many times teachers, they have this phenotype of what they perceive giftedness to be. And remember the collage I showed you earlier? Many don't believe that giftedness looks like the young Black male who was sagging, who had the sagging pants, or the Black male who had the tattoos. Poor test performance. That's a whole conversation in and of itself of how standardized testing favors those who actually construct the test. One of our theorists from ages past, Asa Hilliard, he said that a test will ask one of two questions, and typically we focus on the wrong question. A test will ask, what do I know? And too often we focus on, do you know what I know? What do I mean by that? The test should be assessing, what do you know? What do I know? But instead, it's assessing, do I know what you know? And what I mean by that, because you were the one that selected this test, then you made an informed decision about what you even decided what education is, or what it means to be learned in this particular area. You selected this chemistry test, this physics test. You chose these questions. So now I'm trying to figure out if I know what you know to show that I have been successful. And then finally, the very last reason is choice, C-H-O-I-C-E. Students, particularly Black students and Black male students, many of them will, what we say, dumb down their potential. They could be wildly, wildly brilliant, but they will choose to hide and to cover over their gifts and talents. They won't manifest their gifts and talents. Because, why? Because being gifted, being high achieving, being successful, sometimes among their peers and among those who they're in cohorts and collaboration with at their age and school level, they become very jealous, envious, or very, very disparaging about the academic gifts and talents that the students exhibit. Next slide. We talked a little bit about this, but one of the things that we need to move beyond is this whole notion of a deficit model approach. What is a deficit model approach? A deficit model says that Black males are not successful. They're not achievers. They're not going on to college. They're not. So all of these thoughts and ideas are what we call deficits. But by me choosing to focus on academically gifted and talented African-American males, I have chosen to focus on assets. As opposed to looking at what Black males are not doing, I chose to focus on what Black males are doing, particularly those who are academically gifted and talented. So we need to move beyond deficit modeling to asset modeling. Next slide. One of my good colleagues and friends is Dr. Donna Ford, who is now professor at The Ohio State University. And years ago, she published a work with Cynthia Tyson and Trotman in 2002, and they identified what they call the 7 major symptoms of deficit thinking. And we see here, without reading them all to you, I won't do that, but just take a peek at these. And I would encourage you in your spare time, what are some of these deficit-minded approaches, some of these deficit symptoms? What are some of the ones that you see out there in your schools or out there as you interface with these populations? And I can tell you just from my experiences that one of the major ones was efforts to communicate with Black families and communities about Black education. So involving the parents, involving the community in what they know best to inform and help these Black males to be successful. We don't do that, not at a rate that we should. And next slide. And let's go one more, next slide. And I just wanna, as we move to a close, I just wanna share with you all my years of work and my years of research focusing on academically gifted and talented African-American males. My research is all coalesced into this particular model. I call it my AGBME model, academically gifted Black male engagement model. So all my years of research, I have found that these factors, these 6 factors are what lead to Black males being successful and being retained in institutions of higher education. So we see here at the core is the institutional environment. So whether these students are in a HBCU, historically Black college or university, or in a PWI, predominantly white institution, at the core is the environmental context, but around the core are all these other issues that lead to these Black males being retained and being successful. You see at the top, relationship with faculty. Peer relationships are important. Family influence and support is important. Self-perception, and also the choice that students make about even attending a particular college or even selecting a particular major. Next slide. And I'm not going to really talk about these. I'm just going to show you these frames. This is my book, Building on Resilience, Models and Frameworks of Black Male Success across the P20 pipeline. So much of what I said today is actually in this volume. And the reason I put this volume together is that I wanted folks who were interested and very invested in this work on Black males to have a compendium that they could pull off the shelf that would give them an idea about how to successfully develop programs that would help these Black males to move forward with their educational careers. Next slide. This was my first book, so much of what I've done has been based on my seminal book, my first book, authored book that looks at academically gifted African-American male college students. So in this book, I really wanted to, and this book goes all the way back to my dissertation. I studied gifted Black males, and I wanted to know what the institutional context, how it impacted their success. Okay, and let's move it on. And let's keep moving. And I will close with this very short video. And we've talked a lot about race relations, equity, equality, but I think this video gives a really good life lesson on how we should think about equity and equality, particularly for our students of color. So I will leave you with this.
Thank you so much, Fred, for this interesting talk.
Are there any questions out there related to the presentation, or questions in general about the research focusing on high achieving Black males? Also, anything in particular that you would like to know about this research as it influences what we're doing in the Mach 3 Center?
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Dr. Fred Bonner, for this impressive and interesting lecture. We highly appreciate your continuous contributions to the ICIE and looking forward to meeting with you in our conference in Finland next year. Thank you so much.